My name is Philip Brown, a park ranger here. Of course, I'm from the state of North Carolina. We're going to be discussing the actions of a brigade of Confederate soldiers. We're going to be mainly focusing on July 3rd, 1863, on the actions that we know today as Pickett's Charge. The men that we're going to be talking about are a mixture of men from Tennessee and Alabama. We call them the Archers Brigade as a unit. Now, the brigade itself is comprised of an interesting set of men, and my intentions on this program are to get you guys to understand the experiences of the men on the ground, the people who actually experienced this, the individual soldiers that went through the Battle of Gettysburg. So we're going to be talking about some of these specific people. Within those people, we're going to be looking at how soldiers during the Battle of Gettysburg held themselves accountable to their calls and held themselves accountable to the unit that they fought with, despite some of the really tough odds that they were put up against in actions like Pickett's Charge. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first person that I want to introduce to everyone is this fellow right here. This is Archibald Norris. He was born in Rome, Tennessee. Do you know where that is? Me neither. But it's in a part of Tennessee that's in the northeast corner above Nashville, but not all the way up in the corner where I understand you're from. He was known by his friends as Archie, so you might hear me referring to him as Archie a couple different times in the program. He was born in 1840, so here at Gettysburg he was coming up on 23 years of age. He was the son of a prominent farmer there in Tennessee, and he went on, after helping out with his father there on the farm, to attend Allegheny College, which is ironically located in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And he graduated from there in 1860 as the valedictorian, #1 in his class from Allegheny College. After graduating first in his class, he returned home to help out with his father's farm, but also to become a superintendent of a college, White Sulphur Springs College, there in Tennessee. Now, the interesting thing about Archie and the Civil War is that he did not think that secession was a very good idea. When the Civil War really got started in 1861, he didn't think that secession for Tennessee was a very good idea. He actually left us a really great record to refer back to when it comes to his feelings in the coming of the American Civil War. We have most of his diaries today. It's held in the Tennessee State Archives. He wrote in 1861 that the Union ball is in motion. May it continue to roll and increase. What he is referring to is some of the public political meetings that he attended in Tennessee, and how it seemed as if Tennessee was not going to secede, that they were going to stay there in the Union. And he thought that that was a really good thing, that they should not leave the Union. He's going to attend more and more of these public political meetings in the spring of 1861, later writing, "Every day seems to develop more clearly the policy to be pursued by Tennessee. She should maintain an armed neutrality and assume the office of mediation between the conflicting sections of the country. The evils which our once happy but now distracted country is suffering have all been the work of demagogues, of politicians, who have made their efforts subservient to partisan aims and have wielded the government as an instrument for the upbuilding and upholding of political parties." He had a pretty strong opinion of the political situation there in 1861, that Tennessee should not get into the Civil War. They should remain neutral in between the Union and the South, which was beginning to surround them as more and more states began to secede. Oddly enough, a very large section of Archie's diary is now missing. April and May of 1861 have actually been torn out of that diary. We don't know what was in those pages, but evidently his opinion on secession changed, because in May of 1861 he enlisted in the 7th Tennessee Infantry of the Confederate Army. Tennessee voted to secede in the first week of June of 1861. They're going to be the last state to secede of all the southern states. And in that, he is going to join the Confederate Army. And in his diary there in May of 1861, when the pages pick back up, he says that I returned to Lebanon. I've joined the company of Robert Hatton. I did it reluctantly, regretted the necessity, and yet hoped there will be no need for my services. I went into this measure with the conviction that it was my imperative duty. I owe my allegiance to my state, and though I may regret the steps which my state may take, yet it is my imperative duty to support it in such an appalling crisis as this, and to it will my support be given. So he saw Tennessee as it being about to secede and decided that he should stay with his state no matter what his state decided to do. You see this all across the South. In 1861, men are joining the Confederate Army. Some of them are very into secession and the idea of the South becoming its own country and supporting itself, and some of them were more reluctant, but they went into it because their state had seceded. His father evidently did not like his enlistment. He was very angry with Archie. He said that Pa is very grieved at my having joined the volunteers, and had I not joined, I would not now, merely for his sake. It is grievous to see him so sorrowful. I said just a minute ago that he enlisted in the 7th Tennessee Infantry Regiment. This regiment was formed there in May of 1861. It's going to be comprised of about 1,000 men, all total, just like most Civil War regiments. They're going to include a collection of men that would give the companies, there's 10 companies in each regiment, a nickname given for each and every company. This regiment had some really interesting company nicknames. The Hurricane Rifles was one of the company nicknames. The Statesville Tigers was another. Ironically, there was a company called the Grays and a company called the Blues. Archie is going to end up in that company that's going to be called the Blues, and here at Gettysburg, he's going to be commanding that company. So evidently, his feelings about, or his misgivings about secession had gone away, and he became really committed to the Confederate cause. The unit is also going to include men like this. This is a post-war photo. We're going to pause a minute for this bus to pass. His name is Junius Kimball. His friends called him June Kimball. We don't know a whole lot about Kimball prior to the American Civil War, but we do know that once he ended up in the Confederate Army, he became a violinist in the regimental glee club. And he was said to be a very entertaining guy. The glee club would often play for the soldiers when they were in camp, and also for civilians whenever they were camped near towns. We're going to find out that on July 3rd, 1863, June Kimball is going to trade his violin for a rifle, and he's going to be participating in the battle action that takes place right here in the fields in front of us. June Kimball, by the way, was a member of the 14th Tennessee. I'm going to begin to name off the regiments that are making up this brigade. So we have the 14th Tennessee with June Kimball, the 7th Tennessee with Archibald Norris. There's also going to be a unit of Tennesseans called the 1st Tennessee Infantry. Those are going to make up the Tennessee men that are going to be in this brigade. The unit is also going to be joined with some men from Alabama, the 13th Alabama Infantry Regiment and the 5th Alabama Battalion. So it's a mixture of Tennesseans and Alabamians here at Gettysburg. The Alabamians were regarded by their Tennessee friends to be simple farm boys. And I think this story about some of the Alabama soldiers really illustrates that sort of hayseed opinion that the Tennesseans had of some of those Alabama soldiers. There's 2 men in the Alabama regiments. One is named William Fulton, and the other one is named William Frost. Now, early on in the war, when they joined the Confederate Army, they're going to be told at one point in June of 1862 to guard a bridge over the Chickahominy River. You may have heard of that river if you studied the Civil War to any degree. And they're going to be told to guard this river one night in June of 1862. They're going to later describe it as one of those inky, dark nights. These men had never seen combat, and in the darkness, they became very, very nervous about Union soldiers that they had been told were in the area just on the other side of the river. To add to their nervousness, William Frost and William Fulton remembered that the frogs on the Chickahominy River were extremely loud that night. In fact, they would later remember the night as the night of the Chickahominy Frog Celebration. The frogs were so noisy that they couldn't hear anything going on around them, and everything that they heard, they began to think were Union soldiers moving through the woods, and they began to get more and more nervous as this night went on and on. Just as daybreak was beginning to come on, a Union soldier across the river struck a match to light his pipe. And William Fulton thought that that was a Union soldier firing a rifle at him. And he dove off of the bridge into the river. This caused Frost to double over in laughter. And these two men were stuck in this situation, one trying to climb out of the river and the other one trying to stop from laughing at the other one. Now, of course, their laughter ended a little bit later on because the next morning they were engaged in the 7 Days Battle, which is really going to be the first battle that these men from Tennessee and Alabama were engaged in. To join the men from Tennessee at one time was a group of men from Georgia. The 19th Georgia Infantry Regiment at one time was in this brigade, but they were shuffled out when the Alabamians joined this brigade. And I think the way that these men remembered this switching of the two units really sort of illustrates how the unit felt about itself. The men of Archer's brigade remembered that the men of the 19th Georgia, when they were reassigned to another unit, was very sad at having to leave the brigade. They really enjoyed being a part of this Tennessee and Alabama brigade. And the new Alabama regiment that was joining was very, very happy to be joining the men from Tennessee into this brigade. That's the way the Tennesseans remembered. If you look at their individual diaries, the Georgians were actually happy to go and join some other Georgians, and the Alabamians were upset at having to join the Tennessee soldiers. They wanted to be a part of an all-Alabama unit. Now they're going to be commanded here at Gettysburg, all of these men from Tennessee and Alabama, by this guy here. This is James J. Archer. Archer is one of the more interesting men to fight in the American Civil War. He was born in 1817 in Maryland. He was the 8th out of 11 children in his family. And he was an extremely educated man. Before the Civil War began, he attended Princeton, he attended Bacone College, he also attended the University of Maryland. In all of his education, he got a degree in civil engineering and also another degree in law. In college, he was nicknamed Sally. You might be wondering how this guy got his nickname Sally. A lot of his classmates considered him to be an extremely feminine guy. He had sort of this feminine appearance. He was very dainty. He was always very, very nicely dressed. So they sort of nicknamed him Sally. He's going to serve in the Mexican War leading up here to the American Civil War. He's going to leave the Army after the Mexican War to practice law. But he's going to re-enter the military in 1855. And when he goes back into the military in 1855, he's going to be assigned out to the Pacific coast. So when the Civil War begins, he's actually in Oregon. And he remembers that when the Civil War was getting going, he would write home and he told them, if Maryland secedes, if Maryland leaves the Union, I'm going to come back home and offer my services to the Confederate Army there in Maryland. But as most of you probably know, Maryland never seceded. They always stayed in the Union throughout the entire Civil War. Nevertheless, Archer made the decision on his own to head back east and eventually join the Confederate Army in Richmond. And he's going to do so. In his travels from the West Coast towards the east, he remembered riding in boxcars with other Union soldiers. He, of course, had already resigned from the United States Army, and he was going back to join the Confederates. You can imagine how nervous he might be riding with uniformed Union soldiers, knowing that he was going to join the Confederate Army. Apparently he kept his head down because he didn't get any trouble on the ride over here from the west. Now when he becomes the commanding officer of this brigade of Tennessee and Alabama soldiers, he is going to be universally hated by his men. In fact, I have a quote here from a member of the 7th Tennessee that remembered Archer as being, his exterior was rough and unattractive, small of stature and angular of feature. His temper was irascible, and so cold was his manner that we thought him at first a martinet. Very non-communicative, and the bearing and extreme reserve of the old army officer made him for a time one of the most intensely hated of men. So he was very hard on the men in camp. So they began to have a very bad opinion of Archer. However, after they were engaged in their first battle with him, they realized that he was an extremely hard fighter. Archer was always seen to be in the ears of the rear-ranked men, right there on the battle line, shouting into their ears and cheering them forward as they went into combat. So after they were engaged in their first battle with him, their opinion really went up, and he became a very beloved man in the unit. We are going to transition now to the other side of the road. Do you guys have any questions before we move out? Any questions at all? Okay, then we're going to go ahead and head over there to the other side of the road where we're going to talk about how this unit gets here to Gettysburg. So we have transitioned over to the west side of West Confederate Avenue, and we are looking out to the west. We're standing right now on Seminary Ridge. If you guys would look out here to the farm buildings that we can see from our perspective here, just beyond that you're going to see a little rise of ground. That is an arm of McPherson's Ridge. And you're going to see some trees there also where the ground meets the wood line. That again, that's near the crest of that southern arm of McPherson's Ridge. Now just above those trees, you're going to see another line of trees which is just barely obscured by a little bit of haze today. On a more humid day, it's a little bit more noticeable, the distinction between those bright green trees in our front and the slightly obscured hazy trees just beyond. Those trees just beyond the green trees, that is part of Hare's Ridge, which is going to be very important to some of the fighting that we're talking about just in a second here. So I wanted to get you guys oriented. That is facing off to the west here, and those are the two land features that we're talking about. Archer's Brigade is going to be one of the lead units to move towards Gettysburg as the Battle of Gettysburg begins on July 1st, 1863. The night before, on June 30th, they were camped near some farms along the Chambersburg Pike, which is located over here in this direction. Now, the night of June 30th was actually a fairly cool night, something like what we experienced last night maybe. It was also fairly rainy. A lot of the Confederate soldiers remembered trying to find a good place to sleep despite it being a little bit chilly and rainy. Some of them, including some of the Tennesseans and Alabamians in Archer's Brigade, began to go from door to door to the farmers looking for hay. And they're going to use that hay to make beds on the ground, to spread out some dry hay to sleep on. They're always getting turned down. As they go door to door, you know, the farmers are telling them, no, I don't have any hay right now, or you can't have my hay. Eventually, the men get tired of being turned down, and they simply push one of the farmers aside and head into his barn to get the hay. They open the barn up and they find this massive mountain of hay. And as they begin to pull the hay out of the barn to make beds, they discover that the hay pile is so big because the farmer is hiding bacon underneath all of it in his barn. He knew that the armies were headed his way, both Confederate and Union, and he decided to hide his store of bacon. We don't know how much bacon was there, but I can tell you that the Confederate quartermaster had to send wagons to this farm to haul the bacon away. It was enough bacon to feed the entire division. Supposedly that's what they ate the night of June 30th, 1863. So they're going to get that nice meal of bacon the night of June 30th. They're going to be on the road the morning of July 1st, sometime around 5 a.m. before the sun is up. They're on the Chambersburg Pike marching towards Gettysburg. Now, what are the Confederates doing heading towards Gettysburg? They simply want to find out what is in the town. They have heard reports that the Union Army was moving into Gettysburg. Some of the Confederate generals thought that it was just local militia that guarded the town. So they're going to send Confederates here the morning of July 1st to find out if it's local militia or if it's the lead elements of the Union Army. Archer's Brigade is going to be the first men coming down the road to find out what is here. They're going to be encountering some of the Union cavalrymen just out west of the town on some of these outlying ridges that we were talking about just a moment ago. What the cavalry and the Union Army wants to do to the Confederates that are marching here is to delay them. They know that the town of Gettysburg is important because of the road network, and it's also important for the high ground that's located out to the south of the town, and they want to delay the Confederates from getting into the town before the majority of the Union Army is able to arrive. So what they do at 7:30 in the morning is they begin to fire and fall back. So they're going to fire a few rounds and then fall back a little ways, fire and fall back. What they're wanting to do is they're wanting to get the men of Archer's Brigade to spread out into their long battle lines. Archer's brigade here at Gettysburg numbers about 1,200 men. So simply getting 1,200 men aligned in the battle lines that they used during the American Civil War takes a great deal of time. So they're hoping that if they can get them to spread out and commit to fighting the cavalry, it's going to slow down their advance. And that's exactly what they do. Archer's brigade begins to spread out along the southern side of the Chambersburg Pike shortly after they are fired upon by the Union cavalry. As they move forward, they're going to be crossing over several farms. And at one point they paused to realign their men and maybe get a drink of water from their canteens on one of these farms. They're standing by the farmhouse in battle line, standing at attention, when suddenly a cellar door of the farmhouse springs open and a dog comes flying out of the cellar and immediately begins to bite at the ankles of the men of Archer's brigade. And they're kicking the dog, trying to get it away. As they're doing this, a farmer emerges from the cellar wearing an apron. Apparently he'd been doing some type of woodwork maybe in the cellar as the Battle of Gettysburg was beginning right there on his property. Apparently he had no idea that anything was going on because he was astonished to see Confederate soldiers on his farm. And he looks around and he asks them, what's going on? What is about to happen? And some of these Tennesseans say, well, there's about to be a battle. You might want to get out. And the man replied, a battle between who? And they replied, A.P. Hill, who was their corps commander, and the Union Army. And the farmer looked at these men from Tennessee and he said, well, could you tell A.P. Hill to hold on for just a second? I've just let my cow out to pasture, and I'd like to get it back in before you guys start shooting. Now, we don't know what happened to the cow, if he got the cow back in or if it ran off. There's actually mixed accounts of what happens with this dog. Some men reported that somebody in one of the Alabama regiments actually shot the dog when it was biting at their ankles to try to get him to quiet down. Nevertheless, they push on beyond this farm, headed in our direction. Eventually, they get the cavalry to really begin to fall back, and just as the cavalry lines are about to break, the Union infantry begins to arrive on the field. Some of the Union infantry that is coming on the field is a part of the famed Iron Brigade. They were personally commanded right there in that moment on the morning of July 1st by John Fulton Reynolds, who commanded the 1st Corps of the Union Army. The Iron Brigade is going to manage to get in line and slam into Archer's brigade just as Archer's brigade thought that they were about to break the Union line of cavalry. In that moment, of course, John Fulton Reynolds is going to be struck in the head by a bullet. He's going to be the highest ranking officer killed in the entire Battle of Gettysburg. He was allegedly killed by somebody in Archer's brigade. The exact person we're unsure of. In the same moment that Reynolds is shot and killed, those men of the Iron Brigade who wore these famous black hats begin to encircle the men from Tennessee. One of the members of the Alabama regiments looked out above the smoke and yelled, "That it's not no militia. Those are those black-hatted fellers and the Army of the Potomac." So in that moment, they realized that this is not militia and it's no longer cavalry. This is the main body of the Union Army that's arriving on the field. When the Iron Brigade slammed into Archer's brigade, parts of the Iron Brigade begin to wrap around the flanks of those men from Tennessee and Alabama, and many of them are forced to surrender. Exactly how many we're unsure of. Maybe as many as 300 or 400 of Archer's brigade were captured as prisoners. Of course, amongst those men that are captured is their brigade commander, James J. Archer. General Archer is going to be the first general captured out of the Union Army in over a year's time. He's going to be tackled by a man from Wisconsin in the Iron Brigade and drugged back through the Union lines. When he gets on the backside of the Union lines, he's going to encounter an old friend of his, a Union general named Abner Doubleday. And Doubleday extended his hand to shake Archer's hand, and he said, "Archer, so glad to see you." And apparently Archer responded something along the lines of, "I'm not very glad to see you," and walked on without shaking his hand. These men from Archer's brigade that were captured sort of had their own microcosm of the Battle of Gettysburg experience of their own. They're going to be marched a great distance over a very short amount of time. In fact, they're going to be in Baltimore the morning of July 3rd. They've walked all the way to Baltimore from these fields that we're on right now in that very short amount of time between July 1st and July 3rd. They're going to be separated, of course, into various groups and sent out to prison camps. Some of them are going to spend a great deal of time in those prison camps. Archer himself would be there until the summer of 1864, a full year that he was in prison. So when you lose your brigade commander during the American Civil War, somebody has to replace him. And this is going to be the person that will replace Archer as the commander of the Tennessee and Alabama Brigade. This is Burkett Fry. Now, Fry was born in what is now West Virginia in 1822. And he's sort of a character of obscurity now, even to many Civil War historians. What you need to know about Fry, though, is that he was extremely tough. Early in life, he was a little bit indecisive. We can know that by his academic record. He first went to Virginia Military Institute, right there in Lexington, Virginia, but decided to leave there and go to West Point. He thought that was a better school. He got an appointment there to West Point and decided that he was going to go and study military tactics at West Point. He graduated in 1846 from West Point, but he decided rather than enter the military, he wanted to practice law. So he began to practice law. But when the Mexican War began, he decided he wanted back in the military, so he joined the Army and participated in the Mexican War. When the Mexican War concluded, he left the Army once again to study law this time, or to practice law, this time all the way out there in California. Just before the war began, he moved back to Alabama, where he became a cotton merchant. When the war begins, he joins the Alabama regiments, specifically the 13th Alabama, becomes their leader, and then of course the brigade commander here at Gettysburg. Leading up to Gettysburg, going back to him being extremely tough, he was wounded at Seven Pines, he was wounded at Antietam, he was wounded at Chancellorsville, and he was also wounded here at Gettysburg. We're going to talk about his wound later on. Each time he was wounded, he returned to the field and took command of soldiers. He survived the war all the way till the end and actually became a fairly old man before his death. So he's going to take command of the brigade in the aftermath of July 1st, 1863. The brigade has been wrecked across the board. They've taken hundreds of casualties from artillery and from the infantry fire, but they've also suffered a great number of casualties as prisoners of war. Like we said earlier, somewhere around 300 or 400 men. We're not sure of the exact numbers because they didn't take a roll call the night of July 1st. The first roll call that they take is actually after the battle itself. We're not sure what's July 1st and what's July 3rd casualties. Any questions so far? Okay, we're going to transition back to our starting point there on the west side of the road and talk about the lead up to their big assault here on July 3rd. So I want to summarize that battle action as a whole. We talked about specifically what Archer encountered there on July 1st. Eventually the Union battle lines do collapse. The Confederate Army manages to arrive here from both the west and the north at the exact same moment. They attack from both directions. Eventually the Union battle line collapses and they begin their retreat. And from our position here on the east side of West Confederate Avenue here at the Tennessee Monument, I can point out a few key land features or landscape features, terrain features that have to do with that evening July 1st situation. So the Union Army retreats through the town and they're going to end up down here on Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill is going to be that higher portion of trees to the left of those white buildings that are about a mile from where we are. Cemetery Hill today is largely obscured by trees. Those trees wouldn't have been here at the time of the battle. So the Union Army is falling back towards Cemetery Hill in the afternoon of July 1st. The Confederates, Archer's brigade included, think that they have done a great thing. They think that they have broken the Union Army and that they're on the brink of completely falling apart. What they don't realize is that the Union Army is falling back to some excellent defensive ground. They're going to begin to array artillery and infantry all along Cemetery Hill, and throughout the night of July 1st into July 2nd, the Union line is going to spread down Cemetery Ridge. And we can see Cemetery Ridge is about a mile from where we are right now. It's marked by the monuments and the sparse trees we can see out there on that ridge line. Additionally, I want to point out a couple of other things farther off to our right or to the south. We have Little Round Top there, which we can clearly see from where we are. It's that open face, the open hill there. It's got the monuments on it. And then just to the right of that and elevated above, that's Big Round Top, which is completely covered in trees which is sort of hidden by the wood line there in front of us. We're standing once again on Seminary Ridge. That is Cemetery Ridge. It's important to keep those separated despite their names being almost identical. Throughout the entire day of July 2nd, 1863, Archer's Brigade is going to be told to rest. They recognize that they've taken a lot of casualties. They've taken a lot of men as prisoners. So they're going to rest along the Hagerstown Pike, which is just over here to my right. Most of you cross that, or all of you cross that at some point or another to get here. It's the last traffic light before you enter West Confederate Avenue here on the battlefield. So they're going to rest there along the Hagerstown Pike throughout the entire day of July 2nd. They're going to hear most of the combat that's going on down there along Little Round Top and Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and even along the area that we're in right now. But for the most part, they're not going to participate in those attacks. They're going to be told to rest with some of their other Confederate brigades in the same situation. But they're going to be heavily used here on July 3rd. In fact, we're going to find out that they are going to be the center unit in this grand charge that we now call Pickett's Charge by today's nomenclature. You might be wondering how it is that a unit that took so many casualties on July 1st ends up being the center of the battle line for Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863. You might be wondering, why would Robert E. Lee want this severely weakened unit here in the middle of all this? Does Robert E. Lee know how weakened this unit has been by their fighting on July 1st? The short answer is that yes, Robert E. Lee recognized that this unit was severely damaged, yet he believed that they were strong enough to be here in the center of Pickett's charge. And to understand the thinking of Robert E. Lee and the battle plans that become Pickett's charge, we need to step back all the way to the morning of July 3rd, just as the sun is coming up. Does anybody really know what Robert E. Lee's plans were the morning of July 3rd, 1863? They're very different from what we know today.
Attack both flanks?
That's right. So he attacked both flanks. Robert E. Lee wants to renew the attacks from July 2nd. So he wants to get Hood and McLaws' division underway and to get them to try to attack Little Round Top and Devil's Den once again. He also wants them to attack Culp's Hill, the Confederates way on the left flank, to begin to attack Culp's Hill. His intentions are to break the Union line from two different directions by attacking it on the flanks. So once again, going back, he's going to use his Confederate soldiers that he used on July 2nd down there, but he's going to add to them the division of George Pickett, a division of Virginians that have not seen combat here at Gettysburg. So he's going to decide to use them to strengthen the attacking force there the morning of July 3rd. But those plans are going to change as the day goes on. The attack on Culp's Hill does in fact get underway, but it's repulsed very shortly after it begins around daybreak on July 3rd. The attack going on over here to our south, unfortunately for the Confederates, there have been so many men killed and wounded on July 2nd that it's impossible for the commands to be passed down the chain of command. So the command or the orders get confused as they try to get down the chain of command, so the attack never really gets underway. And this is a big frustration that Robert E. Lee has here on the morning of July 3rd. And so for that, his thinking about what's going to happen here on the afternoon of July 3rd is going to change over time. He begins to shift his thinking from hitting the flanks to hit the Union center. What he believes is that George Meade, commanding the Union Army, has pulled reinforcements off of the center of the battle line and moved them to the flanks, maybe to reinforce Little Round Top's area and to reinforce Culp's Hill area. He's going to think that the center of the Union battle line has been weakened from the previous day's fighting. So what was an attack from both flanks in Robert E. Lee's mind is going to begin to change. He's going to use the division of George Pickett. He's going to leave Hood and McLaws alone, knowing that they have been wrecked from July 2nd at this point. He's going to use the brigades of George Pickett's division, and he's also going to add to them the brigades of Heath's division, which is, of course, is going to include Archer's brigade. They're going to be strengthened on top of that by the remnants or parts of Pender's division. So we've got all of these Confederates coming together to make this attack on the Union center. Now, have you guys studied much of Pickett's charge? You guys have a working knowledge of it? You know that you can see this in the 1993 Gettysburg movie. Pickett's division went into that fight with their brigades stacked up. So there was 2 brigades in the front and 1 brigade in the back. And so that's going to create a very powerful movement forward if you've got all those men stacked up. So they're going to attack in 2 lines. Now, what the movie doesn't show you is that that attack in 2 lines was actually made by mistake. That was never the original plan for George Pickett. He wanted them to be all spread out in one big line. But when they began to move into the area, and you can see that if you go down there and explore it, there was not enough room to fit his entire division on one line, so they end up double stacked. All of the Confederates on this side of the attack, including the men of Archer's brigade on the left of the Confederate line, they're also going to be double stacked. There's 2 brigades in one area, stacked up one behind the other, making the assault. However, the stacking of brigades on this end of the line is not made by accident. And this is where we get into whether or not Robert E. Lee knows how badly Archer's brigade has been hurt on July 1st. Robert E. Lee made 3 rides of the Confederate battle line, up and down, making sure that everything was in place. On the 3rd passing by of Archer's brigade, he turned to some of his staff members and he pointed at the men of Archer's brigade and he said that I see many friends missing from this unit. Surely these men should not make the attack. However, the day is getting late and he was unable to shift around the men. So instead, he brings in extra Confederates behind Archer's brigade to reinforce the line. Does that make sense? How they're stacking them up. The men of Archer's brigade remember all of this going on as this lull in the middle of the day. Some of the veterans of Archer's brigade that had seen lots of combat knew that there was something wrong with it being so quiet, and seeing Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals riding up and down the line. One member of the Tennessee regiments later wrote that early on the morning of July 3rd, Heath's division was moved to the right and formed a line on Seminary Ridge, opposite and about a mile from the center and crest of Cemetery Ridge, upon which the enemy were strongly posted behind works, with parks of artillery covering their entire front. Now he's going to begin to describe the terrain, and the interesting thing about listening to this quote is we can actually look out here and we can see exactly what he is describing. An open plain with a slight incline to the foot of Cemetery Ridge extended from Seminary Ridge with no obstructions between except 3 fences, 2 rail or worm fences and 1 slab fence nearest to the enemy's front. And if you've been counting the fences, you'll know that he's actually off in his count. His memory has mistaken him. There's actually many more. For about 4 hours or more, all this was under the eye and scrutiny of every veteran in Heath's division as they stood in line, each knowing what the ominous silence pervading the whole field meant, and each counting the probable results. So they obviously know that something is about to take place, and they're beginning to wonder about their future. June Kimball himself actually wandered up to the area that we're standing in right now. Most of the men of Archer's brigade were actually posted over here on the other side of the road near where we were just a moment ago. But June Kimball wandered up here to take a look at what was going on in front while they're sitting back during this lull. June later wrote that during the lull already oppressive, I walked out alone to the edge of the open, some 50 yards in advance of the line then lying in timber, and there I deliberately surveyed the line from Round Top Mountain on our right to the suburbs and spires of Gettysburg on the left. I sought to locate the point on Cemetery Ridge about which our brigade and regiment would strike the enemy, provided our advance be made in a straight line. Realizing just what was before me and the brave boys with me, and at one of the most serious moments in life, I asked aloud the question, June Kimball, are you going to do your duty today? The audible answer was, I'll do it, so help me God. I turned and walked back to the line. How does it look, June? Said Lieutenant Waters. I replied, boys, if we have to go, it will be hot for us, and we will have to do our best.
When I responded to my own question as to doing my duty, a change of feeling immediately took possession of me. All dread even passed away, and from that moment to the close of that disastrous struggle, I retained my nerve, and my action was as calm and deliberate as if upon dress parade. It was different from all other experience, many and various, in my 4 years of unbroken service. Before these men get underway on this attack, there's of course going to be a tremendous bombardment of the Union line on behalf of the Confederate artillery. About 150 Confederate cannon all total will participate in this bombardment. What the plans are for the Confederate artillery is to shell the center of the Union line with all 150 of these guns for about 20 minutes time. And they hope that after 20 minutes of shelling, the Union line would have been broken up enough so that the infantry would have an easier time assaulting and breaking the center of the Union Army. But of course, if you studied anything about the Battle of Gettysburg, you know that the bombardment really didn't have its intended effect. The gunners for the Confederate artillery were actually unable to find the range. So that most of these shells were actually shooting over the Union line and missing them by several hundred yards. But the entire valley was filled with smoke, so they were unable to see whether or not they're hitting their targets. All they know is that the Union artillery is continuing to return fire. So the bombardment that was supposed to last about 20 minutes drug on for nearly an hour and a half. And in that time, the Confederate artillery fired about 19,000 shells. If you do the math, that's about 3 or 4 shells fired every single second. The bombardment could be heard clearly 34 miles north of where we stand right now in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And allegedly, some of the window panes were rattling in Philadelphia, which is 100 air miles from where we are right now. The men of Archer's Brigade are going to be huddled down on the backside of Seminary Ridge during most of this bombardment, but each and every one of them had a distinct memory of what it was like to be here. June Kimball, the guy that we were just talking about a second ago, remembered it as this: at about 1 o'clock, a solitary signal shot was fired by Longstreet's command. Instantly, every battery upon the Confederate line opened upon its mission of death and destruction, and was as promptly responded to by every battery, I presume, on the Federal line. And the third and last day of the Battle of Gettysburg was on. For about 1 hour, an artillery duel, the equal of which was never fought on this earth, followed this signal gun. The roar and crash of 500 booming cannon, screaming and bursting shells, and the swish of crashing solid shot brought forth a veritable pandemonium. The very earth shook as from a mighty quake. So intense were its vibrations that loose grass, leaves, and twigs arose from 6 to 8 inches above the ground, hovered and quivered as birds about to drop until the mighty roar ceased, and it did cease as suddenly as it began. Another member of the 1st Tennessee Infantry said that about 11 o'clock the fiercest cannonading known to warfare was begun. For 2 hours the old hills trembled as if affrighted. The limbs and trunks of trees were torn to pieces and sent crashing to the earth to add to the havoc among the gallant boys who waited anxiously in order to charge. Now, they remembered a lot of the environment, but it's also important to keep in mind that they are taking casualties from the Union return fire. In fact, a lieutenant in Archer's Brigade remembered lying face down on the ground next to one of his friends. He had his arm up over his friend's shoulder, keeping their heads as close to the ground as possible to try to keep them safe, when a Union shell entered his friend's body via the head and exploded inside his body, wounding the man who wrote the account, but also taking, obviously, the other one out of the war. So again, the cannonading is going to cease. You might be wondering, why would they stop shooting if they weren't hitting their target? Well, going up and down the Union battle line, some of the Union officers were telling the Union cannons to stop returning fire. They recognized that the Confederates were trying to find the range and that they were judging their fire based off of the Union return fire. So if they stopped returning fire, they might get the Confederates to think that they were having some sort of effect, but of course, largely they were not having the effect that they intended. So at about 3:30 in the afternoon, 15,000 Confederates are going to step off in this assault. Archer's Brigade is going to be right in the middle of it. Confederates stretching far off to their left and far off to their right, about a half mile in either direction. The next part of the program, we're actually going to follow in their footsteps across the fields. If you guys have any questions, we can take those now. If you don't have any, we're going to go ahead and head out. Okay, so we've moved out off of Seminary Ridge. We're standing on the property of the Bliss Farm. And I want to take a moment here to discuss the terrain that surrounds us and some of the terrain that you've already covered as well. Show of hands, who has walked Pickett's division over there? A couple of you have, okay. What did you notice about the terrain that Pickett's division covers?
You have places where they can't see, you kind of go up and down.
You go up and down, so you've got lots of swales. The ground undulates as you move forward. You can actually look over here and see some of those hills and swales. We can't obviously see part of the ground because it drops off just beyond that fence line in the distance. But now look around for just a moment at the terrain that we are in, and the terrain that we've covered, and the terrain that we are going to cover. It does not undulate. It doesn't have all of those swales. What that means for the men of Archer's Brigade is that they don't have cover at any moment in this assault. As soon as they stepped off from Seminary Ridge, they came under fire from the Union cannon that were all across Cemetery Ridge. Now, a few visitors have asked me, how has this terrain changed over time? They're referencing Camp Colt, which was a World War I tank training ground that you guys are actually standing on right now. Believe it or not, just before the United States entered the war, there were tanks training right here on the grounds that we're on. In fact, if you look hard enough in some of the history books and photography books that we have, you can see a French Renault tank using the bank of the Bliss Farm barn as a ramp and going up and over that piece of ground that's right there in front of us. Of course, you guys know about the Pennsylvania bank barns. They would use that as a ramp to drive the carriages up into the second floor of the barn. So the terrain changed a little bit with the tank training grounds here with Camp Colt, but for the most part, as a whole, when I'm talking about the fact that Pickett's division went over this rolling ground versus the men of Archer's Brigade going over this flat ground, that still remains the same no matter what the tanks did here just before World War I. So they're going to be exposed to fire shortly after they step off. And for those of you here and at home that are curious about the alignment of this brigade and how the regiments were put in the battle line, you would have had the 5th Alabama Battalion on the far left, and that's mainly what we've walked just now, is the far left of the brigade. Next to them, moving towards the center, is the 7th Tennessee, then the 14th Tennessee, then the 13th Alabama, and finally the 1st Tennessee. And the 1st Tennessee is going to be the regiment that connects with Pickett's division as they begin to move forward. Originally there was a big gap in between those two bodies of Confederate soldiers moving forward. Men of the Tennessee Regiment, specifically this man in the 7th Tennessee, remembered that when observed by the enemy, the vicious roar of artillery began its deadly work. Soon shot and shell were plowing through the Confederate ranks, but on steadily on the line moved without a waver or break, save as gaps were rent by solid shot or exploding shell. He's remembering the fact that the Union guns that were not damaged during the bombardment immediately opened fire on the Confederates as they would have been able to see them on this open, flat ground. They're firing solid shot, big solid cannonballs or solid bolts from the rifled pieces. They're plowing up the ground and taking out a handful of men at a time. And then, of course, there's the exploding shells that were exploding over top of Archer's Brigade, taking out 10 or so men at a time if the Union gunners were able to find their mark. At one point in the fight, June Kimball was marching along with the 14th Tennessee when his friend William McCullough came up next to him. And June Kimball remembered leaning over into McCullough's ear and screaming, "Billy, stay with us." And Billy responded with that theme of accountability that we've been talking about, "I am with you." And in that instant, either a bullet or a shell fragment crashed through McCullough's head, killing him instantly. The brigade began to really take casualties as they came into range of the shell fire of the Union guns, as they really find the range on them. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about what this environment would have been like to exist in these units during the assault, specifically going back to the noise. Remember June Kimball yelling into McCullough's ear and having to lean over. There's also the yells of the men coming, the rebel yell, which is an often sort of legendary and mythologized thing, but it was a thing that actually existed. They had this very distinctive yell that the Confederates would raise during assaults. A man in the 7th Tennessee Infantry wrote later that I do recollect that the rebel yell was started on our right, and I believe that rebel yell was started because they saw Pickett's division emerging from that lower ground on their right, off to the left over here from where I'm standing. In fact, apparently some of Pickett's division did not even know that Archer was over here. They didn't know that there was going to be more men. So when they began to emerge out of that lower ground and out of the wood lines, and they realized how many men were in the assault, this jubilant rebel yell went up and down the line. Moore remembers that the very singular thing to me in this charge was that the previous to this occasion and afterward, we never before failed to increase our speed when the yell was started. Moreover, as far as I remember, we never failed to drive the enemy when we raised a yell. I suppose the reason our speed was not increased in front of Cemetery Hill was that the yell was started much farther from the enemy than usual. Generally, we raised the yell after infantry firing had begun and near the enemy. On this occasion, we marched steadily on, and as soon as the line got closely underway, the enemy's batteries opened upon us with a most furious cannonade. Many batteries hurled their missiles of death in our ranks from Cemetery Hill, which we can see off to the left, Round Top, which is off to our right, and Little Round Top in our front and on our right. The ridge we had left and the adjacent spurs belched forth smoke of battle that obscured the scent with a dreadful and darkened magnificence, and a deepening roar with no exaggeration of language can heighten. So they're going to begin to receive artillery fire from multiple points. All the guns that have been massed on the Cemetery Hill commanded all these fields. So they're going to open fire. Of course, the guns on Cemetery Ridge directly in front, but they're also receiving artillery fire, as this man was just talking about, from Little Round Top. There's some rifled guns on Little Round Top. They can fire all the way over here to where we are now. The thing about the fire from Little Round Top is that as they get closer to the Union line, the cannonballs are striking down the line, taking out more and more men as they go down the ranks rather than hitting the ranks front on. So the scene became extremely chaotic as the men began to raise the rebel yell and march forward despite all of this cannon fire. Another soldier later remembered that we charged in an unbroken line across the fields, through ravines, over fences, on we went, bent on victory or death. The lead rained. The gallant Colonel George of the 1st Tennessee fell wounded. 30 steps farther, and Colonel Fry was checked by an enemy's bullet, wounded in the leg. He called to me and asked for Colonel George, and when informed of his wound, said to me, "Captain, take command of the regiment, proceed with the charge, but don't stop to fire a gun." Burkett Fry, of course, like I just was saying, was wounded. My understanding is that he was wounded a little closer to Cemetery Ridge. He was wounded, we believe, by a Union bullet. It struck him in the thigh, resulting in a compound fracture of his femur. Of course, a compound fracture is having the bone being exposed in the wound, hanging out broken. Fry is going to lay on the fields as his men move forward. Fry remembered the smoke enveloping him as his men moved forward. They began to come out of sight. He remembered hearing a lot of yelling and officers shouting orders. He, unfortunately for Fry, is going to be left behind after the men retreat at the end of this assault. He's left out on the field unable to move. Union soldiers are going to capture him, place him on a stretcher, and take him to a hospital. I want to go back to how tough this guy was and how committed he was to his men. He was seen at a Union field hospital on July 4th, lying in a mud puddle with his wound undressed. And the surgeons remembered looking at him, and he was laying on the ground puffing on a cigar, and he seemed to be very content. He'd either basically resigned himself to death, or he figured that he was going to be okay. Of course, he's going to have his leg amputated later on the evening of July 4th. He is going to be in Union prison, but he's going to be returned to the Confederate ranks, and he's going to take command of the brigade once again and lead them through the end of the war
incredibly tough guy. We're going to move forward now closer to the Emmitsburg Road and closer to the Union battle lines and talk about how this attack changes over time and how the men continue to press forward despite their losses. We'll go ahead and move forward. So the Emmitsburg Road is just out here in front of us. Just beyond there is, of course, Cemetery Ridge. You take a chance now and look back over what we've covered. You're going to see the Virginia Memorial off to the left there. The Tennessee Memorial that we left from is off to the right on the other side of that little block of woods. So we would either be on the extreme right of Archer's Brigade where we are right now, or a little bit off the right, maybe a little bit further along beyond it. But it's really going to be the Emmitsburg Road that's the threshold for this attack. The Confederates still had a decent amount of clout leading up to the road, but once they reached the Emmitsburg Road, everything sort of changes, and this is reflected in the way the men write about the fight. This member of the 7th Tennessee Infantry said that as the charging column neared the Emmitsburg Road, volley after volley of small arms aided with dreadful effect in thinning our ranks. We reached the first plank or slab fence, and the column clambered over with a speed as if in stampeded retreat. The time it took to climb to the top of the fence seemed to me an age of suspense. It was not a leaping over, it was rather an insensible tumbling to the ground, in the nervous hope of escaping the thickening missiles that buried themselves in falling victims in the ground and in the fence, against which they rattled with the distinctness of large raindrops pattering on a roof. Every man that reached the road, in my view, sunk to the ground just for a moment, and only for a moment. Right there, from our right, came 2 mounted officers, and I think this is one of the stranger instances of this assault and some of the odd things that the men of Archer's Brigade saw. One was covered with blood. The other held his head, bowed almost to his horse's neck. On they sped to the road at our left. I know not who they were. In an instant, one rider with his horse tumbled to the ground, and as far as I know, was one more victim added to the great number of the unknown slain. Our stay in the road could not be called a halt. In a moment the order to advance was given, and on we pressed across the next fence. But many of our comrades remained in the road and never crossed the second fence, many being wounded in crossing the first and then the road. A lot of the Union rifle fire was actually going over top of the Confederates. This is very common in Civil War combat for bullets to go over the top of their intended target, overshooting. What they realized, though, in climbing the fence was they were exposing themselves to those bullets that were slightly above head height, and so many of them were wounded in trying to get over the fence. Some of the men in the Virginia regiments off to their right, specifically a lieutenant in Armistead's brigade, remembered trying to get through this fence along the Emmitsburg Road. Like I said, getting through. He tried to get in between the rails, and he got his head caught between those 2 rails. And he remembered the horror of the thought of being struck in the head and left hanging there basically by his head with his head stuck in the rails. So that should show you that they didn't want to go over top, they wanted to go through, but they found out that for the most part they had to go over top of it because of the way the fence is built. This soldier of the 7th Tennessee also pointed out that many men were left behind in the road. Some of them obviously were wounded. Some of them were probably exhausted, but a great many of them probably realized the futility of this attack by the time they make it to the Emmitsburg Road. They realize how many Union soldiers are up here on Cemetery Ridge and how many Union artillery pieces are still here present and working. This same soldier continued to talk about this attack. He said, "With our line materially weakened by the loss of those that remained in the road, we pressed on and struck the enemy behind a fence or hastily constructed breastwork over which the 1st and about 1/2 of the 7th Tennessee Regiment passed. The rest of our command who crossed the second fence had not reached the works because of their horseshoe shape and because the point that they were to have to reach was to the rear and left of where we entered. As we encountered the enemy in his works, all was excitement. Our men fought with desperation and succeeded in driving the enemy from his line. It was a hand-to-hand encounter." We're going to make our way up to the Union battle line and discuss what happens when the men of Archer's Brigade manage to make the Union position. Any questions so far? Anything at all? So we have made our way up to the area called the Angle. We're standing next to the famous copse of trees, looking out over the fields of Pickett's charge, some of the ground that these men from Archer's Brigade have covered. We've talked about how many of the men were left behind there in the road, either because of their wounds or their exhaustion or the realization that this attack was not going to succeed. But many of them do move forward. They sort of get re-energized by the arrival of the second line of Pickett's division coming up, and the second line of Confederates from Pender's division that's coming behind them, and they begin to move forward. Now, the story about the crossing of the wall and how many Confederates actually break the line there with General Armistead has generally always been considered to be a group of Virginians, somewhere around 300 Virginians. That's what the Union soldiers said. That's what many of the Confederates said in the aftermath. But if you go into the accounts of the Tennesseans from Archer's Brigade, many of them talk about crossing the wall as well. And I attribute that to the fact that the men of Archer's Brigade, these Tennesseans and Alabamians, are actually crushed in between a North Carolina brigade on their left and a Virginia brigade on their right. They converge on one another, and the men begin to get mixed together. So most of the men from Tennessee and Alabama didn't make it together as groups, but came in together with those men from Virginia and North Carolina as they crossed the wall. Most of those men from Archer's Brigade that crossed the wall talk about maybe doing 2 or 3 crossings, actually going back and forth. That's because when they break the wall and they come up and over and they push back some of those Union soldiers, they recognize that Union reinforcements are approaching. They hop back over the wall. They sort of do this back and forth for just a few minutes as everything sort of hung in the balance and they weren't sure what to do. In fact, some of the men from the 7th Tennessee would distinctly write about this feeling of being up here at the wall and saying that for 5, perhaps 10 minutes, we held our ground and looked back for and prayed for support. It came not, and we knew that the Battle of Gettysburg was ended. Many of his brave remnant chose to surrender rather than run the gauntlet of the enemy's fire. So shortly after they arrive here and break the Union line, they recognize that that break in the Union line is not big enough to cause much of a retreat of the Union Army, and they also realize that the support troops that are meant to come up here and exploit the opening in the Union battle line are not going to be sent forward. Robert E. Lee has called off any more men being committed to the attack once he sees from his headquarters there on Seminary Ridge that the attack is, of course, failing. What has happened to our men in all of this that we were talking about earlier in the program? Archibald Norris did not write a great deal about his actions here at Gettysburg. He was a company commander, commanding about 30 men in the 7th Tennessee here at Gettysburg. Norris must have been pretty humble when he chose not to write about what he did here at Gettysburg, because what he does here up at the wall is he manages to seize the flag of the 7th Tennessee, tear it from its staff, and stuff the colors inside his coat, protecting it from falling into the Union hands. And it's going to be the only flag out of all the regiments in Archer's Brigade to survive the attack. Every other regimental flag was captured. Norris was recalled later on as a hero in the 7th Tennessee for attempting to save the colors of the regiment. Now, what happens to the flag, unfortunately, we do not know. The flag went missing shortly after the war, after Norris saved it here at Gettysburg. June Kimball. June Kimball managed to survive the assault all the way up here to the wall, and he is going to begin to make his retreat in that 5 or 10 minutes after they were up here fighting amongst the wall up here at the Angle. And he remembered that the retreat was sort of done pell-mell, sort of an every man for himself, falling back towards Seminary Ridge. They quickly realized that retreating could be as dangerous as the assault forward, because the Union artillery and infantry continued to fire despite the Confederates falling back, and they would have been exposed for that mile that we've covered just now in the retreat, much as they were in the assault. So as June Kimball is running to the rear, he's passing by boulders that sat out in the open fields, and as he passed each boulder, he saw a group of 3 or 4 Confederates hiding behind the boulder, loading and firing their muskets, trying to cover one another as they fell back off of the battlefield. And eventually Kimball realizes that's a good idea. So he drops behind one of the rocks and begins to load and fire his rifle. He specifically remembers shooting at a Union sergeant that was somewhere up here past the cannons that we can see here close to us. That Union sergeant, oddly enough, was wearing a red shirt, which made him a very good target for Kimball to shoot at. He remembered shooting 3 or 4 rounds, but he seemed to not have an effect on that Union sergeant, which puzzled him because he considered himself to be a pretty good marksman. He had fallen behind this rock with a Virginian from Armistead's brigade. This was a very young soldier. In fact, Kimball said that he was not old enough to shave. A kid in Armistead's brigade. And he nudged the young soldier in Armistead's brigade and he told him, take a few shots at that sergeant in the red shirt. I've tried to hit him without having any effect on him. And the young soldier in Armistead's brigade looked at him and said, I've been trying too and I can't seem to hit him. So apparently we had a bulletproof Union soldier up here on the wall. Neither of them were able to hit him. So eventually Kimball realized how dangerous the situation was. He was seeing Confederate soldiers being shot around him despite huddling behind the rocks. So he decided that his best bet was to actually surrender to the Union soldiers that were in his front. He's lying on his back behind a rock. In order to surrender, he wanted to get off all of the military equipment he could to signal to the Union soldiers, I'm trying to surrender. So he remembered bowing up off of the ground on his shoulders, unbuckling his belt, getting his cartridge box off, preparing to stand up and surrender, and he realized that, hey, prison camp doesn't sound so good either, and he had sort of this moment of indecision. Got back down behind the rock and strapped all of his equipment back on. Then he decides that they're going to make a run for it, him and this young Virginian. So he nudges the Virginian on the shoulder. He was busy loading and firing just like Kimball was a moment earlier. And he tells the young boy that he's going to cover him. I'm going to fire a round, and as soon as I shoot, I want you to stand up and take off running. Kimball fired the shot. The young boy stood up to run. No sooner had he stood up that a bullet passed through his body, killing him instantly. This was the memory that Kimball was haunted by for the rest of his life, telling this young soldier to take off running and giving him that advice to make for the rear. Kimball himself manages to get back all the way to Seminary Ridge to rejoin the remnants of Archer's brigade, making it off the battlefield safely and of course surviving to become an older gentleman as he is in the photograph that we've been looking at throughout the program. As a unit, the men of Archer's brigade have been absolutely wrecked. Each and every regiment has lost 4 or 5 men carrying the colors alone. 4 or 5 flag bearers per regiment lost. Across the board, none of them suffer less than 50% casualties. Some of the Tennessee regiments take as many as 65 and 70% casualties in their ranks. The men of Archer's brigade came to Gettysburg with somewhere around 1,200 men on July 1st, 1863. At the end of the day, on July 3rd, they realized they've taken about 700 casualties. They have been tremendously weakened. The 5th Alabama Battalion was so weakened that they were put on provost duty for the remainder of the war. So they were actually taken out of battle action for the most part, and they're going to act as military police for the remainder of the war. What happens to Archer's brigade here on July 3rd is the same for the Confederate units up and down the line. They are absolutely wrecked by what has taken place here at Gettysburg. I have actually been talking now longer than the assault itself took. From the time that the Confederates left Seminary Ridge, made it here to Cemetery Ridge, and fell back, we think it was about an hour's time all total. And in that hour, the Confederates suffered close to 6,000 casualties. This is the devastating blow to the Confederate Army that is going to signal their retreat on July 4th. Robert E. Lee realizes that he has tried the Union battle line in every possible location that he can think of, and each time he has been stopped. So he is going to decide to make his retreat back home on July 4th, 1863, amidst a driving rainstorm. Both Kimball and Norris survived the war and go on to become old men. Norris himself was married Christmas Day in 1866, went on to continue to teach and farm the rest of his life. Kimball returned to Tennessee and became a farmer just as well. As I was mentioning earlier, Fry survives being a prisoner of war, survives that tremendous wound, and returns to command a brigade in the field once again. I'd like to thank you all for sticking it out on the program. I'm going to be around here in the shade for questions and discussion. If you guys don't have any questions or have anything to discuss, I hope you have a nice, safe day here at Gettysburg. Thanks for coming out.